Thanks, Cassie, so much for doing the Bible reading in Mark 1. So, do you feel trapped? Does it feel a bit in your life as if you're just a cog in the great machine of life? Or maybe some code in an intergalactic computer program? You know, you're just a hostage to fortune, or karma, as some would put it. The coronavirus, relationships, work, even spiritual forces, everything is outside of your control, and life is just one big cosmic lottery. Is that what it feels like? And into all of that, religion is no help either. And whether you grew up in South India or South London, all the priest ever did growing up was trying to persuade you just to put up with everything, put up with the bad stuff that happens to you, just accept it. The priests, they never changed anything. The message of religion was just, well, life is messed up, deal with it. In which case, if you feel anything like that today, this story here in Mark 1 is dynamite today, as Mark gives us yet another title for Jesus. So far we've had Jesus the Messiah and Jesus the Son of God, and this week we encounter Jesus the Holy One of God. Here Jesus challenges those who simply use religion to get people to accept their lot in life, and instead he uses his authority as the Holy One of God to help the poor, to alleviate the suffering caused by demons and disease. And so we need to be willing to affirm the divinity and the authority of Jesus Christ, and to trust him that sins can be forgiven and lives can be transformed by faith in him. That's what this passage is all about. You see, one of the things I love about Mark's gospel is the way he intertwines words and deeds. In fact, as you read through Mark's gospel, it's very rare for Mark to record a block of teaching all on its own, without directly linking that to something that Jesus did. Jesus is not just about ideas, he is about action, and they're always connected. Jesus Christ makes a real difference in your life. The mess going on over the pond in America at the moment only serves to highlight how important it is to keep words and actions together. Twitter is cheap, but it can, as we've seen, have profound effects. However, what we see this morning is that you can trust Jesus because his words and his actions dovetail and reinforce each other perfectly. You can trust him. But before we look at this passage, I just want to begin by saying a few words about demons. As I said when we studied the book of Ephesians last term, the world of the New Testament is much closer to maybe rural Asia or rural Africa than the Western world today. In many parts of the world, a story told about a man possessed by an unclean spirit, that would be quite normal even today. Spirits are feared, exorcism is a familiar ritual, and those thought to be possessed by an evil spirit, they're considered almost dead while still living. So in parts of the world, this would just be a normal story. However, here in the West, like here in London, let's be honest, we don't really know how to handle a story like this, do we? It's become quite common, hasn't it, for Christians in the West to remove the supernatural from stories like this, to demythologize it, as the academics would say. For example, many Western Christians would read a story like this and they might assume maybe that the man was really mentally ill. Maybe he was a paranoid schizophrenic or had some struggles like that. And yet when we read this, we rather patronize, we kind of assume that, but they were too backward back then, to 2,000 years ago. They didn't understand things like that, like we do today. And so they will, just because they were so ignorant and backward, they put it down to demons and spirits. That's how lots of people in the West read stories like this today. But I want us to see, as we wrestle with this passage, that Mark doesn't leave that option open to his readers. I suppose technically that explanation is still possible, but I wanted to see that if we go with that, then we have to see that Jesus was equally mistaken by the values of our day today. See, look at verse 25. Jesus does not speak to the man. He speaks directly to the impure spirit. And so in writing this story, Mark has locked Jesus into this supernatural world too. There is no room for progressive revelation here. Jesus was not merely accommodating himself to their worldview. No, what we see in this story is Jesus is actively reinforcing it. So if all this stuff about demons is delusional, Jesus must have been deluded too. Now, I know that that's what atheists think about Christians anyway. So, I suppose if you don't buy all this stuff about the supernatural world, then fine. But realize as we wrestle with this passage that you can't call yourself a follower of Jesus if that's what you think. Because Jesus clearly did buy into this worldview. He saw the world as both physical and spiritual, and he dealt with both directly. Anyway, that's the background to this story. Let's look at this title of Jesus, the Holy One of God, together with two very, very simple parts. This is all about the authority of Jesus. So first of all, we see number one, authority claimed, and then number two, authority proved. Excuse me. So, number one, especially in verses 21 and 22, authority claimed. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. See, what is so striking about the teaching style of Jesus was not just the authority that he claimed, it was also the stark contrast with the teachers of his day, the teachers of the law. They were, I suppose, the professional theologians. Their job was to study the Torah, the Hebrew scriptures as well, for themselves. So the teachers of the law, the scribes as they also are known, they had a very different teaching method to Jesus. But their method was one that we would find very, very familiar today. It's the method employed in all British universities. All British academics would do the same. The method of quotation and citation. So I remember when I wrote my essays for my theology degree, as I'm sure Karen knows, Peter Bloxham too, you're told that marks will be deducted from your essay if you don't back up what you're saying with the appropriate quotes and citations. It's not good enough to make a point. The strength, I might say, authority of my argument is increased if I can back it up with a quote from some heavyweight theologian who agrees with me or supports the point I'm making. Well, back in Jesus' day, the scribes were just the same. They never said, this is what the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 mean. No, they always said, well, Rabbi Hillel says this and Rabbi so-and-so says that, and throw it out like that. And after all, why not? What authority does anybody have to speak for God? Every rabbi, even in Jesus' day, felt the weight of that responsibility. It's a responsibility that I feel right now. I think, well, what authority do I have to speak into your life right now? And that's the point. I have no authority of my own. My authority comes from God, from his word. I don't stand up here week after week because I think my words are any more important than anybody else's. I preach because I know these words from the Bible. They come with his authority. And the problem is that the rabbis had got bogged down with other people's opinions so that they didn't really have anything special, authoritative to say at all. By the first century, synagogues had mostly become dry and boring places where famous rabbis were quoted, but really nobody was any the wiser. That is why they were so amazed at the teaching of Jesus. When he read from the Hebrew scriptures, He simply told them what it meant and how they should live. Refreshing, but also a little scary. What right did Jesus have to claim this kind of authority? Who made him an authority on the Hebrew Scriptures? Years ago, when I lived in Edinburgh, the following incident was told to me by one of the elders of the church. As a GP, and with great relish, he once told me this story. As a GP, that week, he'd phoned up a consultant to get a professional opinion about a child he thought was at risk. He wondered if the social services should intervene. And he was put through. First of all, he spoke to a young doctor, and they talked on the phone, and the young doctor wasn't very convinced, and he kept saying to my friend that what he should do is read the guidelines again, read the guidelines. And my friend, the GP, said, no, I have read the guidelines, I think you should investigate. And it went back and forth until the young consultant held firm and said, no, what you need to do is go back and read the guidelines. At which point my friend's patience snapped, and he informed this young doctor in no uncertain terms, I am well aware what the guidelines say. I wrote them. End of discussion. See, Jesus, he didn't need to look up quotations from other famous teachers and rabbis for authority. He spoke about the Hebrew Scriptures the way my friend spoke about those child guidelines. He was, as he taught the Hebrew Scriptures, in effect, he was saying, I'm well aware what the Old Testament says. I wrote it. Let me explain it to you. Now think about that. What does that teach us about the identity of Jesus? Well, we're going to think about that more as we're going to sing a wonderful song together. What a beautiful name. It's all about the person and identity of Jesus. Let's sing that together. Thanks, Karen, for that activity. And now we're back into this passage in Mark 1. So we've had authority claimed. Now, secondly, we have authority proved. Because before we get too carried away, we must remember words in and of themselves prove nothing, do they? To preach with authority, all that you need is total confidence in your own authority. Anyone can claim to authority. Mental health wards today are full of people who claim to be Napoleon Bonaparte, Julius Caesar, or even Jesus Christ himself. And let's face it, if you go on social media, Facebook or wherever, you'll soon discover lots and lots of people with 100% confidence in their own opinion. Maybe, in fact, especially religious leaders like me. Because it's one thing to say it, it's quite another to prove it. That's why we now turn to verses 23 and 26. After authority claimed, secondly, as I said, we now come to authority proved or proven. What would demonstrate Jesus' authority more than having one of his enemies come and obey him? And so in verse 23, we see the clashing of two kingdoms. Just then, a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out. Last week, we saw Mark describing Jesus as the coming king. And according to Mark 1:15, his message is one of his coming kingdom. So here in verse 23, we see his kingdom, Christ's kingdom, confronted by another kingdom, a kingdom in opposition, the kingdom of darkness. And such confrontation comes across very clearly, doesn't it, in the words of the Spirit in verse 24. What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. A direct challenge. Two kingdoms are clashing. Now, if Jesus really has authority, well, now we'll see, won't we? Here's a chance to prove it. And so in response, in verse 25, Jesus just oozes authority, doesn't he? Be quiet, said Jesus sternly. Come out of him. He speaks to this impure spirit almost like an owner to their pet dog. Not only does Jesus give a direct command to the demon, But notice he does it using his own authority. And that is important because according to the general teaching about exorcism and things at their time, that would be totally unheard of. It explains why the crowd are so amazed as they are in verse 27. No one would use their own authority to cast out a spirit. You would always use some spell or incantation. If you remember last term, we started looking at Ephesians by looking at the passage in Acts 19, and we saw that, or their use of spells and incantations to somehow try and control the spirit world. But Jesus doesn't do that. He's using no spells, no incantations, simply his own inherent authority. He speaks, the demons flee. And so, verse 26, the impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. Now, all Mark can do is write down the eyewitness testimony of what people saw and heard. I don't think we want to read too much into the metaphysical claims he's making. However, the crowd immediately drew their own conclusions from what Jesus did and said. The impure spirit obeys instantly the command of Jesus. Jesus the King is here. And the kingdom of darkness is no match for the kingdom of light. The word of the King has supreme authority. He speaks and even evil spirits obey him instantly. And therefore, this morning I want to say, those of you, maybe even right now, who live in fear of evil spirits, I want you to hear that especially. Yes, the supernatural world is real, but Jesus has total authority over it all. If you trust in him, you have nothing to fear from dark powers. He is Lord over all. Whatever religious people have told you, you don't have to just accept life as karma. Jesus doesn't only say nice words, he has the power to change your life too. Just like he does here. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that amazing? And as we work our way through Mark's Gospel, we will see this pattern repeating. Jesus makes outrageous claims in what he says, and then he goes on to substantiate what he claims by what he does. We're going to see that time and time again. Next week, it's going to be exactly the same pattern. Authority claimed, Jesus is going to claim something, and then he's going to prove he can do it by doing something else. You see, Mark has put these stories together to force us, his readers, to come to a conclusion about the identity of Jesus. Who is Jesus? Our story in verses 27 and 28 force us to ask. See, the crowds, first of all, they responded with a question in verse 27. What is this? A new teaching, and with authority he gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him. What is this? They say. That is an accurate rendering of the Greek. That's a good translation. But if we wanted to capture the meaning of what they were saying, we would say, who is this? That's really what they're asking, isn't it? Who is this who does these things? Reminiscent of how we started the series in Mark 8, Jesus asking his disciples, who do you say I am? Who is Jesus that he does these things? But notice that for the moment, in the crowd, there is amazement and speculation about the identity of Jesus, but no more. News spreads about Jesus quickly, but it's only news. And that is a common response from the crowd. It's easy to be interested and know more when you're in a crowd. In fact, many find the anonymity of a crowd comforting. Maybe that's you this morning. Online, it's easy to sort of watch as part of the crowd. And then good. Maybe you want to just remain in the crowd as you ask questions about Jesus, you want to think all this thing through. Then fine. But just realize, as this story shows, you cannot hide in the crowd forever. At some point, we don't know exactly when, but at some point, as in the story with this man, Jesus will get personal. And you cannot remain in the crowd forever. See, alongside the crowd, we also have the response of the impure spirit. to Jesus in verse 24, who says, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And the more I think about those words, the more chilling I find them. Because think about it. Here we have a demon, an impure spirit, freely confessing the identity of Jesus. He knows much better than the crowd who Jesus really is, even though he was still in direct opposition to him. The crowd was still unsure. The true identity of Jesus at this point in Mark's gospel remains a secret to the human beings asking questions and watching. At least it remains a secret to human beings like you and me. The spirits are in no doubt, and because of that, they fear him. In fact, since the punctuation in the Greek text was put in much later, it is quite possible that the demon did not ask a question. It's quite possible that the demon made a simple statement. He simply said to Jesus of Nazareth, you have come to destroy us. Statement. So take careful notice of that. Knowing the identity of Jesus is not enough. As the Apostle James tells the readers of his letter, you believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. In fact, in my job as a pastor, I frequently am in a situation where I've got to ask someone if they're a Christian or not, or maybe tell me how you became a Christian. That's a question I often have to ask people, sometimes in formal settings, like if they want to get married or if they want to become a member of this church. And I find that as I talk to people, you ask that question, like how did you become a Christian, or what does it mean to be a Christian? Often it's not so much what they say, but how they say that tells you a lot, that communicates loads. I remember, this was years and years ago, asking one American lady what it meant to be a Christian, and she gave a really good answer, but the way she said it was just like she was repeating her times table. So I want to say today, I don't really care how well you know the identity of Jesus, how many Christian doctrines you can repeat, because the demons know all of that stuff better than you do. That's not enough. It's how you respond to the person of Jesus that really matters. And it, as we see here, is really bad news if you end up in the other kingdom crying out to him in fear. No, what is more important than being able to point out Jesus in a crowd is being submitted to his rule. Knowing that Elizabeth II is the Queen makes no practical difference to me unless I'm a citizen of the United Kingdom. So knowing Jesus is King, he is the Holy One of God, is of no use unless you're part of his kingdom, submitting to him as Saviour and Lord. So, yet again, we finish our passage in Mark 1, just as we've been finishing each week, and as we're sure we finish every week. Who is Jesus? Today he's made claims of authority, but then he's given direct evidence of his authority that he's not making up. He really has that authority. Today he's revealed his identity as being in direct confrontation and opposition with the powers of evil. He even gives orders to evil spirits and they obey him. Mark in his gospel tells us he is the Holy One of God. £1 million question again to you. Who do you say Jesus is? Let's think about that as we now sing this great hymn, Blessed Assurance, which speaks of the wonderful hope and confidence we can have when we do trust in Jesus. Let's sing.